Hi, I'm Geoff Pynn. I teach philosophy here in the Humanities Department at Elgin Community College. I'm pleased to welcome you today to the first Humanities Center talk of 2021, presented in a very 2021 form, a YouTube video of a Zoom conversation. We're going to be thinking together about games. Games are a universal aspect of human experience. They form an essential part of our shared social environment, which in turn shapes our identities and our institutions. In recent decades, game-inspired phenomena have become more and more common in daily life. This is sometimes referred to as gamification. For example, your fitness tracking watch will tell you when you've won the day by cheering your 10,000th step. Amazon warehouse workers compete against one another in games designed to increase their productivity. If you're on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, or any other social media site, you can see how well you're doing by checking your score, i.e., by looking at how many likes and shares your posts have received. For help understanding the promise and perils of games and gamification, I talked with Dr. Thi Nguyen, professor of philosophy at the University of Utah and a world expert on the philosophy of games. His latest book is called Games, Agency as Art. In our conversation, we talked about what a game is, why games are important, and how they can lead us astray. Dr. Nguyen is a prolific public philosopher. His popular work has appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, and many other venues. He's also received widespread recognition and accolades for his academic work, including the American Philosophical Association's prize for the best article published by a younger scholar in the last 2 years, and selection for the Philosophers' annual 10 Best Philosophy Papers of 2020. Before turning to philosophy, Dr. Nguyen was a food writer, and his skillful passion for rich and evocative descriptive language developed in that context shines through in his philosophical work as well. If you find the philosophy dry, though, I recommend his restaurant reviews, which you can find on the website linked in the YouTube description below, as well as a long blog post recommending many different board games, most of which you may not have heard of before. That's a great place to look for ideas for your next game. And with that, I hope that you enjoy as much as I did the conversation that follows with Dr. Nguyen on games and why they matter. Hi, T. It's great to have you here.
Hi, Geoff. It's great to be here.
Um, I wanted to start with just some questions about you, or just a question about you, to ask a little bit about your own background. You're kind of interesting, not a lot of people think of games and philosophy going together. So can you say a little bit about, what your background is with games and what led you to this area of
Right.
research?
So my background with games is I've been playing my games my entire life. And my background with games and philosophy is for most of my career in philosophy, I could not have imagined doing philosophy about games because you know, just this isn't a field in traditional philosophy. Like most people don't even know there's work in this field. So about my life playing games. I mean, I grew up playing board games. I played a lot of chess. I played a lot of Go. I became an online poker addict. And during I played a lot of computer games. At one point in my life, there was this game that almost destroyed me. Some people know it. It's called Civilization. And I think there's somewhere in uh, LA is like a CD-ROM drive of a Civilization game that I had to like break in half, so I would not, like, I wouldn't continue like destroying my life. And play a lot of role-playing games. And in during graduate school, I got really excited by this like revolution in German and Euro board gaming. Like the thing that a lot of people know, the game that most people know is Settlers of Catan, but there's this like renaissance and this gush of like incredibly interesting game designs that were coming out. And I was playing all this stuff. And then over in my philosophy career, like I hadn't even thought for a second that that's not the kind of thing you work on, right? Not as a philosopher. Um, but I was doing philosophy of art, and I had always had this thought, like, I would have loved to be around in the 50s writing about jazz or the birth of jazz. And at some point I was like, I wonder what would that be like now? What would it be like to write about a breaking art form now? Well, literally at the same time at night, I would be logging on to boardgamegeek.com, writing like, well, this game has an interesting texture, I'm not quite sure but this other game like has a really cool, and then at some point I realized, wait, games are the art form of the now. Like if I want to write about a new art form, I should write about this thing that I care about deeply, that I hadn't even connected in my head, which is the art of games and what they mean to us as people.
Cool. So a couple things that are implied by the answer you just gave is, first of all, that games are an art form, or can be. And that's something that might come as a surprise to some people watching this, or some people might disagree with that. But I want to just take it back a step and just say, like, we all kind of know about examples of games. You went through a whole bunch of them, but can you say anything about like what it is to be a game, or what
Yeah.
games are? Like, that's kind of what philosophers do, right? They define stuff. So how do philosophers define a game?
Right. So this is really particularly famous in philosophy because, as I'm sure Geoff knows, one of the great philosophers in the 20th century, Ludwig Wittgenstein, had this argument that a lot of our terms didn't have clear definitions, but instead there's these loose clusters of things with family resemblances, right? That, uh, like a lot of terms, like there. So there's no property that everyone in a family shares. Like some people have the same kind of hair, some people have the same kind of nose. It's just this loose cluster. So Wittgenstein said that, and his example was games. He was like, games, there's something where there's no quality that all games share. Some games are competitive, but not all. Some games are fun, but not all. Some games, involve movement, but not all. And so, against this background, this philosopher who I love and who's written really influential in my work, Bernard Suits, wrote this book called The Grasshopper. And it was an explicit reply to Wittgenstein. He was like, you know what? Maybe you're right about other things, but I can define game. In his definition, he has a complicated version and a portable version. And the portable version is that to play a game is to voluntarily take on unnecessary obstacles for the sake of making possible the activity of struggling to overcome them. So this is like the center of everything I've worked on, like this concept. And
Can we
what he
just
means
can we
is,
just, yeah, okay, good. Thanks. I was going to say,
yeah,
can we just go through that piece by piece?
yeah, let's roll it back. Go
Yeah,
through it
good.
piece by piece. Okay, so to so what he means. So let me start with an example, and then I'll move back to the definition. So what he means is that, so you're running a marathon, right? And you're trying to get to a particular point in space, the finish line. And what Suits thinks is, in ordinary life, when you're trying to get somewhere or get something, you're doing it because of the value of that thing. So you're doing it for the independent value of the goal, right? But he thinks in
So this is
games,
like exercising or something,
yeah. So well,
or maybe
if you
not.
go to the store to buy, exercise is a tricky one. So
Mm-hmm.
if you go to the store to buy some bread, it's because you want some bread. The reason you're driving to the store is to get some bread. The reason you're doing cancer research is to cure cancer. The thing you're pursuing is the thing you want. The thing about games is you have this thing you're pursuing, getting to this finish line. But Suit says we can tell that you don't actually just value that thing itself, because if you valued it, you'd pursue it in the most efficient way possible. And in running a marathon, there are way more efficient ways than running it. You could take a taxi, you call a lift, uh, take a bird, take a shortcut.
Take a shortcut. I was going to say that's
You could take a shortcut.
they often begin and end close to each other. So
Yeah, right. So the Suits' idea is that if you cross that finish line not obeying the constraints specified by the game, you didn't even cross the finish line, right? A basket, getting the ball through the hoop, isn't a basket unless you did it while facing opponents, throwing, like obeying their dribbling rule, not using a step ladder. If you use a step ladder, it doesn't count as a basket, right? So there's this idea that Suits has, that the interesting thing about games is that the obstacles are necessarily constitutive to the end goals. And I mean, that just means the thing I said before, like it's not a basket unless you did it under certain constraints. It's not crossing the finish line unless you ran that under your power, or whatever the specifications of that race are. So one way I sometimes put it, what Suits shows me is that, I mean, I think this would be too oversimplified for Suits, but a way I like to put it is, in ordinary life, we take the means for the sake of the ends, right? And in game life, we take the ends for the sake of the means. Like I'm a rock climber, and my end is to get to the top of the cliff. But I don't do that because I care about being at the top of the cliff. I don't. actually care, because the moment I get to the top, I just lower off. There are other ways to get to the top of the cliff. I do it because I care about the particular weird struggle of trying to claw my way up this cliff using my own hands and feet, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's an end that you take on for the sake of the struggle. That suits
Mm-hmm.
his account, and I think it's totally fascinating and brilliant.
Mm-hmm. So part of what you're doing when you're playing a game is adopting some goal that you actually don't care about in itself, but for the sake of the pursuit that you'll have to engage in to achieve that goal, and the pursuit is what you care about. But
Right.
you kind of can't pursue it, or maybe not. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but go ahead.
So there's a little technical. We're gonna get philosophical here. So there are two. So here's something that I say about suits that helps me understand suits. I think suits opened up a possibility, but didn't make it explicit. And in some of my work, I've tried to make it explicit. So there are two different kinds of motivation I think you can take in a game. You can be a striving player or an achievement player. An achievement player is playing for the value of the win, and the striving player is trying to win for the value of the struggle, right? So the striving player is someone who's in it. So the achievement player is in it to win it, and the striving player is in it for the process, for the struggle, for the play, or for the benefits that come out of it. But this is, so you might think like, oh my God, how does that make sense with the definition of suits of a game that T just said? Suits is super clear that like, okay, here's an example from him that I've added a little bit to. So imagine one person is trying to climb Mount Everest. So imagine there's some people that are trying to climb Mount Everest for the first time. One person is trying to climb it to be victorious and for the goods that follow from victory, right? Like the professional is doing it because they want to win, because they'll make money from winning, they'll get glory for winning. Imagine an achievement player trying to climb Mount Everest. And another person is trying to climb Mount Everest because the struggle is interesting to them, right? Or imagine a striving player. Both of them are playing a game by Suits' account, because for both of them, the end at which they aim depends on having achieved it in a certain way under certain constraints. So here's one way to put it. Imagine someone passes by in a helicopter and is like, hey, do you want to lift to the top? The striving player will be like, no, because I want the struggle. And the achievement player, who's still playing a game, will be like, no, because then I won't have won the specific game of mountain climbing. You might contrast this to someone who's trying to get to the top of Everest to like pluck a rare herb or something.
Or maybe to rescue a stranded climber.
Yeah, to rescue a stranded climber. Exactly. And if a helicopter passes by and they're like, do you want to ride? That person would be like, sure, right? They're trying to take the most efficient way to the top. And that's why they're not a game player, because the obstacles aren't constitutive of them doing the thing that they're doing. They're just trying to get to the top.
That makes a lot of sense. It seems like in a lot of cases, maybe are people some mixture of both kind of player, or do you have to be one or the other?
Yeah, I think this is me describing the two ends of a spectrum, right? I think most people are some mixture. You can move back and forth between them. I think some people get more competitive, and some people like start competitive, and I think a lot of the times you can shift during a game. Like and a lot of people play different games in different ways. I think that a game that almost everyone plays, or should be played by everyone in a striving way, is these things I call stupid games. So stupid games are games where here's my definition. The fun part is failing, but you can only have fun if you're trying to win. So examples are like Twister, drinking games, the children's game of Telephone, right?
Oh, good. Yeah. Right. So what makes Telephone fun is that at the end, you've failed to do what you were trying to do.
Right. But the interesting thing is, if people garbled the message, so if you don't know, Telephone is when you sit in a circle and one person starts with a phrase and you pass it around and everyone's trying to keep the phrase clear. But at the end, of course, it's always garbled. And then you like the first person and the last person speak the phrases and you see how much garbled it's gotten. So if people are intentionally garbling it, it's not funny at all.
Right. It's like obviously, yeah.
Right. You have to be trying not to garble it to have the fun of failure. Twister, you want to fall because it's funny, but if you physically intend to fall, it's not funny. It's only funny as a failure. So you have to be able to do this weird thing, right? This is striving play. You have to aim at winning, even though what you care about is the comedy of failure.
Great. Yeah, that's a good example. That helps. Okay, well, so we have a little bit now about what games are, this sort of the voluntarily adopting some end for the means of the struggle to get there. So what would you say makes these things particularly interesting, like to philosophers?
Right.
It seems kind of like, yeah, people do all kinds of things. Why are games of philosophical interest?
Right. So one thing is just like the thing that I described to you, a lot of philosophy doesn't have room for. Like a lot of philosophy, there's one of the standard theories of philosophy is that if you're pursuing anything, it has to be that you think it's good, right? Like that's what it is to pursue something is to think it's good. So
Can you give a little bit of an example of that?
I mean, this is so.
I mean,
so
maybe
the,
using one of your examples from before would be fine. But
right. So yeah. So what I think is no, there are tons of things where you're pursuing something but you don't think it's good. So for example, in Twister, I'm pursuing not falling. I don't actually think not falling is good. The thing that I think is good is actually falling. So I can like totally get myself to pursue things that aren't of value to me. So this is this weirdness. And one of my theories is that a lot of philosophy was born of people thinking about the really intensely serious parts of life, like morality and like science and like politics, where people are pursuing things that are really valuable. But games are about the opposite. Games are about play, and play is weird. And I think that a lot of theories of rationality and what we are and the purpose of our lives that philosophers have generated doesn't capture the weirdness of play. And games are a really interesting way to think about play because they're like play that's formalized and written down. And you can like sink your teeth into it.
It's very interesting when I think about the only times I can think of play appearing in a lot of great philosophical works is in the context of talking about education.
Yeah.
So the like, you know, if you look at like in Plato's Republic, part of the way that people get educated is through playing games.
Sure.
But for adults, there's no room for play in most serious philosophy. But it seems like, you know, a lot of us care about play in all kinds of ways. And so it does seem like an important part of human experience.
Yeah. I mean, I do think there's one of the things that's of biggest philosophical interest to me is I think that so Tal Brewer puts it this way. After I wrote my games book, I found this wonderful book from Tal Brewer, The Retrieval of Ethics. And I wish I'd read it while I was writing my games book. And Tal Brewer says that a lot of the way we think is this production-oriented mentality where we think if you're doing something, the good of what you're doing has to be in the end goal, the product. And Tal Brewer thinks, and he thinks this is an idea from Aristotle that's been lost, is that a lot of times you're doing something for the sake of doing it, like for the sake of being involved in the activity of doing. I mean, this is a really sophisticated philosophical way of saying the journey is the destination, right? But one of the worries I have is that, so Tal Brewer thinks that like a lot of philosophers, and I think a lot of people outside of philosophy, don't have the intellectual space or the mental space to see the value of being in the process of something. And instead, they're always looking to the end products. And I think gameplay forces you to see, no, here's something where the value is in the process. And I think that's really, I think that once you see that, you see all kinds of other things we do in life that I think philosophers and other people trying to think about the value of human life miss. The value that's in the process, not in the object acquired or thing made at the end.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, it does seem like there are a lot of things in our lives that we do value simply because of the activities that they involve, like spending time with your friends or playing music or cooking. I guess when you're cooking, you're looking towards the end, but you also enjoy the process, right? So, but what is it that makes games distinctively interesting as an example of this kind of human activity? Something that's sort of and just pursued for the sake of itself or for the experience of pursuing it.
Wait, can we go back for a second? Because you mentioned cooking. Because this is like this is actually one of the things I care. So I think games are an example of this category where they're all kind of aesthetic. Like there's all these beauties in life and all these like thrills and wonders, and we've been really trained to look for them in objects like the sun, nature, a painting. And my theory is that games are one of a huge class of things where a lot of the beauty is in the process, in how we do things. And since we're so trained to look for these end goals, we often miss out on this beauty or underrate it. And I think this actually shows up in cooking. So one of the things that I wrote about that helped me think about this long ago was a little piece where I was like, look, you know what's really weird? When people review cookbooks, they review how good the dish is that comes out of the cookbook, but they don't review how elegant or gross the process is.
Mm.
Um, John Thorne, one of my favorite food writers, says something like, "We keep doing this thing where we're pushing cooking so that we're doing these things that make the process of cooking uglier and grosser and weirder and sadder."
Hmm.
Um,
What's an
to make
example? Can you give an example of that?
okay, so okay, this is one of my this is one of my weird obsessions. So there's been this drift in cooking towards very scientific cooking, and
Hmm.
um, what that means is so you have to boil the potatoes exactly this long to exactly this temperature. You have to cut them exactly this right way, and then they'll come out perfect, and they are perfect, right? But also the process involves like not being centrally attached to the food, but instead like always looking at your watch and always looking at a temperature gauge instead of doing something else. And I think another thing we do when you're not trying to hit the numbers is you smell the food, you listen to it, you like taste it, you adjust automatically to how it like sounds, and that's, I mean, I think that's a very aesthetically rich process. If you're trying to judge when to take the food off of the pan with smell, then you're constantly involved in this like
Mm.
sensitive aesthetic
Hmm.
orientation. But if you're looking at your watch, you're not smelling it, and I
Yeah,
think
and
like
well, the smell is like about you're trusting your senses rather than somebody else's
yeah.
device.
I mean, it's about trusting your senses, but it's also like a pleasurable sensory exercise. And it feels like a lot of the times the kind of new scientific cooking involves a sacrifice of the aesthetic pleasure in the process
Hmm.
for an aesthetic pleasure in the end goal. But also a lot of the times you're cooking for a lot longer than you're eating. And it's right. And it's if the whole cooking process could be infused with aesthetic interest, then that seems better.
Yeah, for sure. It seems like certainly more enjoyable. And of course, we all agree that, or most of us agree, that games can be like a lot of fun, very enjoyable, and certainly fun is an important part of life, and pleasure's valuable. But is there anything deeper about games that we can start to understand about ourselves by thinking about them in this new philosophical way?
Right. I mean, uh, are you asking me if they're art? Or are you asking me
Well, okay,
if
that's
they're
right. I guess we could
stupid?
go back to that. That's right. No. So forget this. We I put a pin in that before and didn't come back to it. So yeah, so you said earlier in your answer about games that you talked about how they were art. So say a little bit more about that. What does
Right.
that mean, and how can you justify that idea?
So I mean, there are a lot of there. P.S. There's a huge literature of philosophers arguing about the definition of art, and I'll just tell you that it's mostly boring. It's really boring. It's mostly really boring. And so there are a few ways to approach this question. One way is to be like, look, what is art? And one response is art is people trying to sculpt aesthetic experiences. They're trying to sculpt experiences of beauty and comedy and thrill. And it seems to me like games are obviously in that category, right? Someone is tinkering with rules in order to get you to have this experience of like loveliness or thrill. Though I think one of the big differences is in traditional arts that the beauty or whatever is in the object, and in
Mm-hmm.
games the beauty is actually in you. Like you're the one that becomes like interesting, or your brain or your
Yeah.
body is graceful. And when you're not willing to see that and center that, then you'll miss out on what's important about
Mm-hmm.
games. Um, I mean, I also think that like one of the important things for me is to figure out what games do uniquely. So sometimes when I think like people ask like, "Oh my God, are games valuable?" What I want to say is, uh, sorry, when people ask a question like, "What are games art?"
Art. Yeah.
What they really mean is this question of like, is playing games stupid? Are they a waste of time? Right? Like, I mean, in some sense, I don't. care about the art question. I care about the waste of time question,
Hmm.
right? Like the art question sometimes is like a semantic question. The
Yeah.
waste of time question is like
Well, let's
real.
go to
This
the
is
interesting one then. Are
okay.
games a waste of time?
Yeah. So what do they do, right? Um, so I think if you understand what games actually do, you can see their special place in human life. So let me lay out the theory now. Here's the theory. What is the art form of games? What are they doing? So one way to ask this for me is to ask the question of what's their artistic medium. That's a way to think about what makes them special. So a lot of times people want to say like, oh, oil painting, the medium is oil and brushwork. Film, the medium is like stories and character and images and sound. Like, so what's the medium of games? And a lot of people want to say like, games are a visual medium, or games are a story, or game designers sculpt environments. And I always think like that gets part of it, but it actually doesn't get the heart of it. So my theory is that game designers work in the artistic medium of agency. And what this means is they're not just creating stories or environments, but they're creating you. They're telling you who to be in the game. They're telling you what your motivations are. They're telling you what your abilities are. They're sculpting like a kind of like skeleton of action for you to enter into. And this kind of shows you a way to think about the value of games. So there are two ways, there are two things. One, game designers are sculpting beautiful or interesting or funny actions for you. They're sculpting ways of doing things. And that's a specific aesthetic sculpture. So that's valuable in that way. And the other is that games convey modes of agency. They convey mental attitudes or styles. So, I mean, every game in its rules. So think about this. What do different media record, right? So pictures record images, novels record stories. What do games record? What's written in there? And I think what's written in there is a mental and physical style. I should say, mental and or physical style, right? Each game has a certain like mental space and practical space that you enter. Like chess is about thinking tightly ahead, about geometric look ahead and calculating exactly what your opponent's going to say. And diplomacy is about lying and manipulating people's emotions. And like Tetris is about incredibly quick turns of things to make them fit. And Portal is about like teaching your mind to see in 4 dimensions and like make weird connections through 3-dimensional space. And each of these is like a different mental attitude, and the game hold that. It's a recording of a different practical style. So that's one thing. That's one of their values. You're learning, just like novels can teach you what it's like to be a kind of person emotionally, and like philosophy books can teach you like what it's like what this argument is. Games can teach you like what it's like to think a certain way, or to move in a certain way.
It's fascinating. The other examples that you gave are things where you can learn whatever it is that the art object is telling you without actually doing it. So when you read a novel, you learn about a story, but you don't live the story. But games, it seems like it's not quite like you're actually doing the thing or acting in the way that, well, but you kind of are, right? I mean, it's much more like learning through doing than it is learning through reading or listening, or kind of in a passive way. It's a much more active mode of learning.
I think there are a lot of philosophers of art who would immediately resist you and be like, hold on. Reading isn't inactive at all. Reading is imagining, and you're doing all this stuff. But it is true that you're doing full-fledged actions with games, right? I mean, this one
Twister.
thing in the back. Yeah, you're doing it. I mean,
you're all entangled with your friends. It's you're not imagining it.
One interesting thing, Jesper Jewell has a book called Half Real that really helps me think through this stuff. And he says that games, he's thinking about video games mostly, are half fictional and half real. And what he means is something like, so if we're playing an online shooter and I headshot you, then 2 things have happened. I have fictionally killed you and fictionally shot you, but I really have beat you, gotten points, and shown my better skill, right? So there are these 2 things happening at once. It's also, so some people are like, are all games fictional? And one of the examples I've given is, here's a game that's not fictional at all. You have yourself airdropped naked into Alaska, the backcountry, to see if you can survive on your way. I mean, people do this kind of game all the time, right? That game is 100% real, but it's still a game. You're doing it.
Yeah.
So yeah, but so one of the things I think is it's just, I think that's just the nature of games. They're a profoundly different kind of art from the traditional art because you have to take actions and make decisions in order to interact with them. You have to make causally effective decisions. And one of the things I think is one of the reasons people have misunderstood games so much is that they're used to this paradigm of the traditional art where they're like, okay, it the what's interesting has to be in the game itself. It has to be in the stable thing that we all see, and it can't be in
like
players'
in the
performances.
instructions or the board design or
right.
the
graphics or
okay.
the static story, right?
Yeah.
So I think what's going on is people are like, well, with paintings, the thing that we're looking at something in common. The artistic value has to be in the part that's in common. And so when they turn to games, they look for the static parts, and they're not going to look to player activities because player activities vary widely. My playing of like a Zelda game is going to be so different from your playing. And one of my thoughts is actually games are a profoundly different form where there are aesthetic qualities, but they emerge in players' actions, and player actions are so variable. And I don't have more to say than that. Don't try to force games into your older artistic paradigm. Don't try to be like, well, they have to be like paintings in order for them to be good. And then like either only look to the static parts of games or even make games that are more static. So one of my worries in the background, one of the things that led me into this project was playing more and more games that people were like, oh, this is artistically worthy. This is a serious game. And finding that the thing that people thought was artistically worthy was the fixed script, like the cut scenes and the fixed video. And I think it was easier for them to process that it was artistically
it's like
worthy.
watching a movie.
Because it's like a movie, and we know movies are art, right?
Yeah. And we know how to watch movies. Yeah.
And I think like that, and so forcing games into that other paradigm, it only on the appreciative side, it makes us miss out on them. But I think that thought is also infecting game making, right? More game makers who are like, I want my game to be important, are like pushing them away from what's unique about games, which is the space for our own agency, often our creative agency that's open-ended, towards making them like movies with a few branches or something like that.
So I want to follow up. This is just departing from the questions that we had talked about before. So feel free to say, I don't want to answer that, but I want to ask, there's this, in thinking about the relationship to games and other art forms, insofar as games, the medium is agency. And so to play a game is to actually be an agent. I guess we should clarify, when philosophers say agency, they don't mean like an ad agency or something. They mean like the property of being somebody who acts and does things, right? Who's an agent in that sense, in this very broad sense. So to play a game involves actually enacting some form of agency, but actions like have this moral dimension, right? Which is maybe not present in, you might think there are some films that are sort of, you can evaluate other artworks morally, but you're actually doing something in a game. You're like acting in a certain way. And our actions are the primary focus of like moral evaluations. Right. And so I wonder, is there a kind of moral dimension to games that is important or interesting and different perhaps from other art forms?
Yeah, this is, I think, something you have to deal with when you're thinking about the ethics of games. Like when I swat the ball out of your hands in basketball or headshot you in a shooter, I'm blocking you from getting what you want. I'm actually like destroying your plans. So I think so there's this theory that's popular in some circles in thinking about games called the magic circle theory. And it just says whatever happens basically it's what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, but for game spaces, like whatever happens in games is just automatically morally neutral. And I don't think that's right. Like, among other things, like sexually harassing people through the texting function of like a shooter, like that's something real that we've done that's bad, right? Genuinely, like if I'm at like, let's say that I'm really good at chess and you're not, and I like lie to you and convince you that whatever, we start playing a game and I just like humiliate you over and you're crying and I don't let you, I'm like, no, we're playing. I'm like, no, magic circle, dude, nothing here matters. Like, right.
Yeah, that seems pretty implausible to me.
Why? Because you're way better at chess. No.
Oh, no, the magic circle theory.
Yeah.
You would crush me at chess, but
Right.
it seems like
It seems
whenever you're doing something,
you're doing it.
there's an action that can be
Yeah.
evaluated. But there's another end. Oh, so go ahead. I'll let you finish.
Yeah. So I think there's a weaker version of the magic theory, circle theory that I believe in, and that weaker version is something like, in specific contexts, some actions that look like they're aggressive or blocky aren't actually. And this is what I mean. So if we're both, let's say that you and I are both striving players and we're about to play some basketball. If we're striving players, what we want is an interesting struggle. That's what we're in it for. So and our interest in winning is just temporary, right? It's just something we put on to have an interesting struggle. So when I block your shot, I'm blocking your in-game attempt to win, but I'm actually helping you get your real goal of having an interesting struggle. So I call this theory competition is cooperation. And in some cases, competition can actually be cooperation. But what's really interesting to me is it's not guaranteed. So like, it depends on the game actually turning actions into the kind of thing the other person wants. And it depends on other things like skill alignment. So if there's a certain kind of game and I drag you into it and I'm just way better than you and I just keep smashing you the entire time, it might be totally not fun or interesting to you. And I think that's a reason to think that that's unethical, is because games are ethical if we actually do the thing that helps us both enjoy it. And in a lot of contexts, what that is competing the hell out of each other.
Yeah.
But only if we like are of the appropriate skill or pick the appropriate game or something like that.
Right. Well, I was thinking about this other dimension too of like, so some games like basketball aren't like this, but a lot of games involve the agency involves the kind of pretending that you're somebody else or taking on a role. It's, role-playing games, I guess, are the ultimate, maybe not the ultimate, but one example of this. But, video games are like this, and board games are often like this. You pretend you're you're an army of woodland creatures and you have to defend your, the keep or, so, but once you're pretending to be something, is there another level of moral evaluation that comes in? I'm thinking about like pretending to do really evil things or pretending to do things that you would ordinarily regard as truly immoral.
Right. So, I mean, I tend to answer this. So I don't think there's some sense in which, because there's this fictional layer, you're never wrong. But I do think a lot of so you can analyze into two layers. Let's say I headshot you in this shooter
game. Yeah.
On the fictional level, I've taken a fictionally bad action, and fictional bad actions are fiction. And like, we see this stuff all the time, right? Like, I really don't think there's much, there's a huge gap between the fictional ethics of like doing things in a game and the fictional ethics of like watching The Sopranos or Breaking Bad or something, right? And on the real layer, I have blocked your plans. But again, on the real layer, this competition is cooperation argument kicks in, right? Like, it could be that the reason, if in blocking your plans, I'm helping you achieve this experience of an interesting struggle, then I'm actually helping you.
Yeah.
But I will say that there's some really interesting caveats. So Chris Bartell, who's another philosopher who works in this space, has this great new paper. And one of the things he points out is, so some people want to say like, no, fictional actions in games are always fine. And he says, and the standard argument is because it's just like an image, right? You're just doing something in an image. It's not reality. And Chris Bartell says like, no, sometimes we do things to images and it's fine. And sometimes we do things to images and it's terrible. And so he gives an example. Here, let me adapt the example to my own race because it's racially sensitive.
Okay.
So let's say that you, Geoff, burn a bunch of pictures of Asians. Why have you done it? Option one, you have been researching a history of Asian Americans in America, and you had a lot of printouts in your office. And now it's fall, and your office is full, and you're going to burn all these printouts. That's fine. You're burning images there's no problem with that. Option two, imagine you're a white supremacist, and at a white supremacist rally, you burn a bunch of pictures of Asians. Like, well, that seems problematic. And that seems problematic precisely because, like, the burning of the image has a political meaning. So Chris Bartell says this is like burning someone in effigy. And he points out, he says, like, so he looked at this case. So apparently there are a bunch of Red Dead Redemption players. There are suffragettes and Red Dead Redemption players too. And a bunch of people were going around killing all the suffragettes to express their hatred of feminism.
Oh,
And that seems more like an effigy case, right?
yeah, for sure.
Right. So I'm not going to say that, like,
Hmm.
every fictional case is scot-free, but fictions provide a lot of protections. And
Yeah.
again, right.
Well, and it's interesting in that case, it's still not the thing that happens within the fiction that itself is morally problematic. It's what it means, right? It's like killing a suffragette in that game may in fact be fine in the context of a gameplay if you have some game related reason to do it. But when these guys are doing it, they're doing it to send a message, like at the real level or whatever.
So I mean, one way to say it is, I mean, I'll admit I don't know a huge amount about the theory of fiction. This is not my area of expertise, but I do think that his argument is showing that it's not showing that the fictional action is necessarily bad in and of itself. You could read it as saying that the actions are bad when they have some real world impact, and sometimes fictional actions have real world impact.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, good. Yeah.
Maybe that's the way to read. I think he actually went to say the fictional action is itself bad in this case, and then you could. There's a huge debate to be had there.
Yeah, sure, right. That's philosophy.
That's philosophy.
We got to move on, or we're gonna run out of time. So I was gonna ask next. This is an interesting. I mean, so it's not just that games are philosophically interesting, but actually, I think you think that games are like good for us in some way. I mean, it's not just that they display this. I mean, it is that they display these interesting features about motivation and human action, and help us see things about art. But you also think it's just they're really good in some ways, at least, or they're important. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm trying to develop this thought. I mean, people know this thought. Playing is important, right? I mean, I think there's nobody in child development that'll be like, play is bad. I mean, I kind of want to develop out the theory to say that play is continually important for adults too, and that something dies in you if you don't play. Games are not the only way to play. There are other ways to play, but games are one way to play. So what makes games good for us? So besides just the value of games, the artistic value of games, so my basic suggestion is that games do this thing where you get to experience different agencies, and like any other medium, learning a ton about different possibilities helps you be more free, helps you have more options, helps you develop your, like, so the standard example is like the reason we should have free speech or whatever is, and the reason libraries are important is that you should have exposure to a large number of ideas to choose for yourself what you believe, right? Without that, you don't have intellectual autonomy. You don't have freedom about what you should believe. So there's this basic thing where knowledge of different ways of life and different ways of being frees you up. And my suggestion with games is really that, like, games give you access to different ways of being, and when you increase your inventory of different ways of being, then you become more free, and you become more able to jump. You have these different inventories of, like, ways of thinking that you can use, or you can use to model other people. I often think that, like, I believe that people think I'm politically savvy in my department, and one of the reasons I'm politically savvy is I know what it's like to be a psychopath trying to kill my department. And the reason I know what it's like is I've played one in a board game, and so I can model that mind. There's one worry. Here's something that you might find philosophically interesting. One worry some people have is that games can't make you free because games involve rules, and so they're necessarily authoritarian. Miguel Sicart makes an argument like this, where he says, like, look, real play is free and free form and makes you fluid and flexible, but games are about rules. And I mean, implicitly, rules are the opposite of freedom. And I think that's wrong. And there are a couple ways of saying why that's wrong. One way, there's a more philosophical way and a better way, but I'll start with the more philosophical way. So the more philosophical way is to say, look, not all constraints make you less free. Constraints can make you more free when they increase the real possibility. So here's a simple example. Imagine you're in an open field. You can walk anywhere. You're totally free. Now imagine we put some walls and a roof in. We built a house in the middle of the field. Your movement is now constrained. You can't walk in every single possible direction. There are walls there. But I think you're actually more free because you now have a richer and more substantive option space. You can be inside or you can be outside. The loss of the ability to walk exactly here is less valuable than this rich choice.
Yeah.
If you go back to Suits,
yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
so if you go back to Suits, Suits' core idea is that game obstacles constitute new kinds of actions. So the constraints in so there are these constraints in basketball, but they also create new activities. What it is to pass, or or like block, or like get around someone's guard. Those actions are new actions and new possibilities that are created by the constraint structure of basketball.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, I even think about things like having too much unstructured time can actually start to feel very burdensome, even if in theory it's total freedom.
Yeah.
But why not? You often you need things telling you what you can't do in order to understand better what you can. Maybe.
I mean, this is really related to this other thought, which is like, which is like, so the idea that no constraints leads to freedom is based on this, to me, really weird optimism that if you let us to ourselves, we will, like, left to our own devices, we'll be maximally free. And I think actually left to our own devices, we'll repeat habits and be stuck in our own personalities.
Totally.
And a lot of the times, you're like, yeah.
I feel that.
A lot of the times, like, the temporarily entering into rule structures lets you experience ways of being that are outside of your habit. And I mean, I think we know what this is like. This is how yoga works, right? What my yoga teachers have told me is left to your own devices, you just are stuck in your own posture and your own body. There's one standard pattern of movement. And then the strict rules of yoga force you to find new movement patterns that you haven't had. And then you can learn them, and that makes you more flexible. And this is what I actually think about games. This is the slogan of the book is games are yoga for your agency. Like, they get you to take your soul and push it into different postures temporarily. And as long as it's temporary, and as long as you're cycling through lots of them, then that should increase your inventory of and teach you more ways of being. So that's another way in which rules can make you more free.
Yeah, it might teach you about ways. Well, I guess it makes you more free, but it might teach you about things that you thought were okay, and you learned through enacting the agency in a game that maybe you shouldn't do that.
Yeah. No, I think sometimes by crystallizing something, I mean, I basically think that, like, you can be a kind of crappy person in a certain way, in a certain context, and it's hard to see, but when you are in a game fully acting out the psychopathic role, you can step back and be like, oh wait, now I see what that is. Like, that's totally terrible.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's no guarantee here. Like, I think, like, every medium can be used for good or ill. Like, fiction can be used to expand ourselves, or it can be used for propaganda, and it depends on how we take it, right? Like, some people watch, like, American Psycho, and they see, like, this ironic criticism of a certain kind of like American, like, hyper competitive, and other people watching like, he's my hero, I want to be just like him.
Whoops.
Like, don't do that.
No.
And the same thing is true with games. Like, I think there's a way in which you can delve into a certain kind of, like, hyper aggressive, hyper competitive thing, and you can learn about hyper competitiveness. You can see what it's like. You can also use it as a way to get rid of your own, like, intense impulses, or you can be like, that's how I want to be. And there are different ways to take games. Not all of this is on games. Some of this is on
you, and also and on your teachers and your environment. So, well, that leads to so games are, one of the things I really want to talk about is this buzzword we hear hearing about, gamification.
Right.
And because I mean, so I'm kind of on board now with this idea that games have this value, not just as art objects, but as ways of becoming better people if we use them rightly. I want to say, so there's a lot of talk about implementing games in education through something called gamification. So that seems like a natural extension of this idea that games can be used for good purposes. So I want to say, if you could say a little bit first about just what this term means, and then I'll follow up, but say a little bit about, what you think about the idea of gamification in education.
So I think so gamification is taking um, the design techniques of games and putting them into ordinary work activities and ordinary life and ordinary exercise and ordinary education. So gamification is stuff like Fitbit, Strava, Twitter,
Mm.
Duolingo, various attempts in work and higher education to add things like levels and achievements. Um, and I think what most people think is like when they ask me about this stuff, it's like, T, you love games, you must love gamification. And this is actually the standard line. Like there are a lot of people out there that think so. Jane McGonigal in her book Reality is Broken basically says, look, a lot of reality is really boring, but we have a technique for making boring things exciting, which is game design, right? Like there's all these like incredibly grindy things you do in like, World of Warcraft, but it's fun because you get like levels and points. So if you just apply that technique to reality, then you'll make reality as fun as a game. I'm totally against this. I think actually, if you understand what makes games good and important, you will see why gamification is very often terrible and dangerous and corrosive. Um,
Okay, well, so I'm going to follow up with that and say, can you say a little bit more about why that is? Now, I want to say, maybe I want to hone in a little bit on, I mean, presumably there's a lot of different ways that something can adapt features of games. So,
right,
for example, in a classroom setting, you might have, for the review for a test, you might break students up into groups and then have a kind of low stakes competition
right,
between them for,
yeah,
that will sort of motivate them to
right,
find answers that they wouldn't otherwise be
right,
motivated to find. Is that the kind of thing that you're
right,
talking about, or do you think it's problematic, or is it something bigger or
right.
deeper than that?
So the thing that I find really problematic is when gamifications become pervasive
Hmm.
um, and are inflexible. So So remember the value of games. So one way to think about remember that part of the value of games for me is they're temporary. You shift into them, you shift out of them. You
Hmm.
try on one, you step back. You try on another, you step back. You plunge in to the game world and you take on its values, and then you step back and you ask yourself if it was beautiful or interesting or you appreciate it or like, right? Um, you're
But you
you're not
slide
in
back
it
into
forever.
normal life. Yeah,
You
right.
slide back
Out.
into normal life and you integrate the lessons of the game into your normal life. Um, and that's important, I think. So games, a key part of games is the point specification
Hmm.
is really specific and narrow, right? You know exactly what you're doing. So for me, so I call this in the book value clarity. Like games give you the experience of value clarity. Like a lot of our life is totally like fuzzy and weird, and we don't know what we're doing, and maybe we know what our values are, but we don't know how to trade them off, and we don't know how to like apply them. And like, I mean, I'm a parent and I want to give my child a good life. Who the hell knows if I'm succeeding, right? That's how do I apply that to this thing in front of me who's currently like screaming and crying because I won't let him have like cookie 4. Like, am I doing well or not? I don't know. But in games, like things are totally clear. Like you know what the points are, you know what you're trying to do, you know what exactly what gets you points, and everyone has the same interest. You're chasing the same points. So there's this moment of like social and complete clarity and values. And it's great. But it's also, I mean, it's also kind of a lie, right? It's an artificial thing that's really
Mhm.
pleasurable to be in for a bit of time and creates all these like possible beauties of absorption. But when you do that in real life, then you're getting people to hyper narrow their goals in real life situations. And those goals are game goals are so much thinner than the other goals we could use, right? Like, so I think about Twitter a lot. Like, there are all kinds of values you could take to communication. You could like be in it for empathy or understanding or connection, but Twitter gives you points for one thing, which is popularity, right? It's like a very thin
Yeah,
view.
yeah.
Same with Fitbit, right? Like there are all kinds of reasons to exercise for good feelings in your body, for like a feeling of gracefulness, for like the beauty of the nature you run through. But Fitbit doesn't measure any of that stuff. It measures steps. Um, and the way in which these things are pervasive means that instead of like being going in and out and discovering new different value systems, you're stuck on one,
Hmm.
right? Like if you care about Twitter, or I mean, I think a lot of these things don't involve formal gamifications, but just involve these point systems that just appear, like GPA. GPA, I think, is like a terrible gamification
Hmm.
because now there's this external value system that's totally inflexible and doesn't see a lot of the world, and suddenly you find yourself just caring about it, and not able to like flex and decide for yourself what you value about your education or your progress through school.
So part of the danger of gamification is this artificial clarity about how you're doing. So you
Yeah.
adopt some, like in Shoots and Ladders, or I don't even know Shoots and Ladders, but Candyland, whatever. One of these games, there's points. Everybody, how all the players are doing, and in more complex games, you might not know, but you'll find out at the end. It's all going to be clear. And so the one danger of gamifying real life is that we introduce this sort of artificial clarity,
Right.
which is appealing, right? People like it when things feel clear. It makes us feel comfortable and feel like we don't have to deliberate too much about what to do. So that's appealing, but then also probably dangerous.
Right.
But is it
the price?
So good,
There's this price, like the price. Like people are like, oh, this is great. You get all this motivation. Like Fitbit gets you super motivated. These gamifications get you super motivated. And I'm like, yes, they do. But here's the price. You have to buy your motivation off the rack. You're like getting your motivation from, it's like a pre-made piece of motivation by like Silicon Valley. So you get all this motivation, you get all this fun, and all you have to do is let Silicon Valley set your values for you. That's it.
10,000 steps.
10,000 steps. I mean, the way I put it is that it's like you're outsourcing value deliberation. So I was really affected by this little bit of, so there's a really interesting book called Engines of Anxiety by Wendy Esplin and Michael Sauder. It's a sociology book about higher education. And it's a study of what happens to law schools, legal educational culture, and legal culture when the US News and World Report starts issuing their rankings of schools. And one of the things you can see, one of the things they track is, so before there's this clear ranking, students would decide for themselves what they valued about a legal education and try to find law schools that matched it. Because there was no ranking. There was just like different schools that were good at different things.
And there was also probably like regional stuff, right? Like going to the law school that's close to you, or that it might be close to where you want to live, or lots of personalized decision factors.
And law schools had their own different missions. Like some law schools were interested in theory, some were interested in like serving underserved communities, others were interested in getting people that wanted to do like social advocacy, right? Each law school had their own mission. And what this book tracks is when the US News and World Report law school rankings come through, all that vanishes. All law schools now are aiming at one value system, which is getting up on the rankings. And all students, almost all prospective law students, they say, no longer go through this process of deliberating what they care about which law school to go to. They just assume that their goal is to get into the best law school and assume that the best law school is the one that's highest on the rankings. So my way of putting it is they've outsourced the process of deciding on their values of legal education. And they get this like great, it's like clear, right? It's great. You feel so like, clear. I know exactly what the best school is. And I know what you should be aiming at.
Yeah, you can feel like you've achieved a lot just on the basis of where you got in, what its number is. Yeah.
And it's inarguable. I won. I got
it's right there. It's on the list.
Right. All you have to do is not think about what you care about legal education and let the US News and World Report set the goal, the value of your career for you. That's all.
Yeah. I had a very interesting experience not that long ago when I was still wearing a Fitbit before I had been persuaded that maybe that wasn't the best way to do things. Not that there's anything particularly evil about them in my view, although you may have a different idea. But I had a very interesting and strange experience, which is that I was going on walks a lot and trying to, it's during quarantine, try to keep active. And I left the house one night for my long walk with my dog. And I realized about halfway through that I had forgotten my Fitbit. I didn't have it. Yep. So the steps I was taking on the walk didn't count. They didn't count. And I went home. I mean, I didn't walk as long as I would have. And I realized as this was happening, like, I was like, wow, this is, I care as much about what the number is on the Fitbit when I get home as I do about the actual walk. It was a very enlightening experience because it made me realize like, wow, this has really kind of done something to my motivation that actually I don't really like.
Yeah. I mean, the way it feels to me is like, there's all these rich and subtle things that are valuable to us. Like our aesthetic experience of walking through the world, the way your mind feels or your body feels in a walk, like the city, they're all these sources of value and they're all kind of quiet. And then the Fitbit is this loud, clear, like, here, I'm counting for you. And my worry is that it's swamping. It's so much brighter and clearer that it's swamping. Now, I mean, I want to be clear. I don't want to say that Fitbits are always bad, right? I mean, again, it's just like it's up to you. It's up to the player. It's up to your
Hmm.
relationship. I mean, I think they're quite motivating, and if you manage that motivation, if you ask yourself, like, is this helping me? Like,
Yeah.
is using this thing making things better for me? Right? Then, I mean, then you rule the Fitbit. But the Fitbit
Hmm.
could rule you. That's the thing that
Hmm.
I'm worried about, right?
Hmm.
That the Fitbit starts to swamp your other values. And one of the worries I have is sometimes like when you get so used to listening to this loud voice from the outside, you can stop listening to like the inner quiet voice that
Yeah.
says like, "Oh, I'm a little bored," or "Oh, that was interesting," or "Oh, like all," or "Oh, that was a great," like all that is too quiet and it's over here, but all you have to pay attention to is this loud thing here.
Hmm. Yeah, the other stuff is hard to notice and the loud noise takes over. So you've talked about a couple of different examples of gamification that are, sort of, well, and I just want to say, so that's the point that you just made. I think is really important. The point is not that gamified systems are intrinsically bad.
Yeah,
It's that they're dangerous, right? I mean, or that they can do things
yeah,
that are not actually helpful and that may be difficult to see until it's sort of maybe not too late, but maybe further along than you want it to be before you
yeah.
can change course. So you've talked about Fitbit and you talked about the US News and World Report ranking of law schools. What are are there other big examples you could think of like gamified things in our current society that have been like
Right,
sort of damaging or
right,
destructive in the ways that you can explain by reference to the fact that they are
right.
gamified?
Yeah. So I want to back away. There's a specific use of gamification, and that's like the intentional importation of uh, game design techniques like achievements and medals.
Mm-hmm.
There's a bigger thing. The thing I really want to talk about. So I have a name for it. I call it value capture, and it's
Mm.
any case where just a clear and typically quantified statement of a value starts to take over your reasoning,
Mm-hmm.
and that includes gamifications like Fitbit and Twitter, but it also includes all these cases like GPA, like BMI. Like I think we
Mm.
there's Fitbits, but there's also BMI, right? Like or
Yeah.
just weight loss. So here's something interesting. Um, Sometimes I talk about some of this stuff, and people are like, "Well, some activities I can see that, but other activities they're already measurable. So like what's wrong with gamifying weight loss? Like, there the easily measurable thing tracks what you value. And I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
hold on, why are you engaged in weight loss in the first place, right? Why is that the activity instead of being more fit or feeling better in your body? And I suspect that the interest in weight loss in the first place arises from value capture and a kind of gamification. That's of all the things you could think about for fitness and well-being, that one is easily quantified. So I think
Mm-hmm.
one of my worries is that the obsession with that already represents, I mean, also money. I mean, basically money, right? Ranking systems, money, like rankings of universities. One of the things that got me really interested in this was the rise of quantified policing in and the ways in which you can there's tons of stuff about this online, but so people started treating certain policing targets like closing your cases as uh,
Mm.
as like central incentives.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things you found was for the first few years this is in place, policing seems to have gotten a little better, and then a lot of police start chasing those particular numbers. And of course, the numbers always come apart from what people care about. So you start seeing effects like uh, police being encouraged to discourage people from reporting a crime that's difficult to solve, because if you report it, then it makes your number look worse, right? So this kind of thing I think is all over the place.
Yeah, sure. You mentioned before we're going to be out of time soon, but I wanted to follow up on a couple of things. You mentioned before you just sort of let the word Twitter fall out of your mouth while you were talking about different gamification
Right.
systems or gamified phenomena. This would be in this sort of maybe this looser sense of gamification. So what is the sorry, maybe I'm getting the terms wrong, but so can you tell us a little more about Twitter, about like what is it
Right.
that you see? What's going on with Twitter?
Right.
How is it like a game, or What's the maybe value capture is a more appropriate
Right.
framework in order
Now,
to
I
talk
think
about
Twitter
Twitter.
might be a gamification. I mean, in the sense that, so there's a lot. I mean, the broader things are things in which large scale institutions start generating these tracking metrics. But I think a
Mhm.
lot of the user interface stuff you're seeing out of Silicon Valley is gamification in the most literal sense. Like,
Mhm.
I think there's evidence that people like Facebook and Twitter literally hired game designers,
Mm.
and in many cases, not just like video game designers, but designers out of the Vegas gambling industry who are
Mm.
experts on getting people addicted to points to
Mhm.
program the exact. I mean, you'll notice this. So on Twitter, especially when the when you get a like, the number rolls up. It's like
It's like a
you'll
little ching. It's like a
yeah,
little. It
exactly.
looks
Right.
like
It's like, and
a slot
you
machine.
exactly. Exactly. I mean, so in this case, I think it is literally they have hired the people that engineered the technology behind addictive slot machines in Vegas,
Mm.
and put them to work at Facebook and Twitter and Zynga and World of Warcraft to make the stuff more addictive. But I mean, if you don't believe me, you should read Natasha Dowshall's book,
Mm.
Addiction by Design, in which she studies the the people that design addictive machines and Vegas gambling.
Mm.
And then after she wrote the book, she was like, "Oh, by the way, hey, the people I was
Mm.
looking at are getting hired by social media
That's.
companies to make it more addictive." So
Mhm.
I think that's a clear case of gamification. And my worry is that there are all these reasons that you might be interested in communication, but they're swamped by the point system of Twitter. And the point system
Mhm.
of Twitter reports popularity, not empathy, not connection, not depth. It reports popularity.
Mhm.
And to the degree that you buy into that, then you are valuing popularity as measured in one specific way by one hardwired device. Um, and we know I mean, there are plenty of studies. What makes tweets popular, the thing that makes tweets most popular is simple expressions of moral outrage to a community that already believes it. I think that's the effect that
Oh.
you're looking at.
Uh, so I know you're pretty active Twitter user.
Yep.
How do you, for yourself, like, how do you experience this phenomenon? I mean, especially as somebody who thinks about these things a lot.
Yep.
Like, you know, when you do a tweet, I'm sure you don't like pretend not to know how many
Yep.
likes it's got, right? I mean, you pay attention to that stuff. How does that affect you, or
It,
how do you kind of navigate this for yourself?
it's hard. I mean, one thing I should talk about, what I should say is Twitter doesn't need to be gamified. Like
Hmm.
Twitter has so many goods, there's so many connective goods, and you could literally ungamify it simply by hiding the points.
Hmm.
That's all you need to do. You could allow retweets, you could have conversations, you just hide the points.
Hmm.
Um, and
Interesting.
I have a really difficult relationship with Twitter. Like I
Hmm.
can feel the thrill, like it hits me, and
Hmm.
it feels like I'm winning at a game when a tweet does well. And then I find myself trying to win again,
Hmm.
and what that feels dangerous to me when I start saying things not because I believe in them, but because they might get me points.
Hmm.
And honestly, sometimes what I do is I delete Twitter for a while and like detox.
Hmm.
Like,
And then when you go back into it, do you find you're less sort of captured, as it were, by?
yeah. I mean,
Mhm.
one of the interesting things to me is there's this fight that you have with yourself. So I had a really stupid joke tweet go viral and get like 100,000 likes. It was like, you know,
Wow.
but it was just a stupid thing. And then like, so sometimes I tweet about teaching to the small teaching philosophy of the small community of philosophy teachers, and that'll get a very small number of likes, but people will like talk about it and it'll change their actions. And
Mhm.
I can feel in myself like, and then I'll get like responses and people will be like, "Oh, what about this?" I'm like, "Oh my God, yeah, I can do that for my teaching too." That's real, right? And
Mhm. Yeah, that's real connection. That's real communication.
right. And but there's literally a fight for myself to thinking like this is actually what I'm here for, not like points over something dumb. And
Mhm.
like I think you have to remind yourself, but it's not just Twitter. It's like all over the place. We're philosophers, and philosophy has like internal scoring systems. There's for people
Sure.
that don't know, there's like literally objective ranked lists of what the best journals are and what the best universities are. And sometimes you face the same thing. You're like, okay, here's a thing that I wrote that got into a journal that's very high ranked. And there's this other thing I care about that got into a, not nearly as fancy a journal. You get the same pull. You're like, oh, I should write more like that, like that thing that got me the big points. Oh my God. And it's like this fight to be like, no, I can't let that into my head, right? I can see that that matters for fairly external reasons, but like, I can't let that dominate me. So it's not just Twitter. It's like all over the place. Like I can feel this like pervasively everywhere.
So I want to just wrap up on this sort of, maybe it's a big question, but we've gone through a lot of things. So we see on one end, we have like the promise and the value of games, which you argue is actually this rich source of, well, philosophically interesting material, but also a potentially great value for individuals and for groups of people. On the other end, we have like the dangers of gamification. This idea of value capture seems to be central there. It's like games they kind of take over your values, and they subtly change your motivational structure. So you're like offloading what you think is important. But there's this real tension, right? So, and it seems like the thing that leads towards value capture is the need to make things simpler, to make things easy, make it easy to understand what you need to do in order to get something, whatever, So in the real world, often we work in like institutions that are very complicated, that need standardization. In classrooms, we need to be equitable and like, things that we just can't, treat each student completely as an individual. We have to make assumptions about what kinds of standard things people should and shouldn't be able to do. It seems like this tension between like being a pure individual and being sort of having your values shaped by an external force is like, this is just a deep fact about like humans living together, right? So I guess with that, what do you think thinking clearly about games can help us see about this? Or maybe you have other thoughts about it. It was not really a question, more sort of like a setup for a question. Then when it came for the question, I didn't really get it. So here's your opportunity to say something about that.
Yeah, I mean, I do. So when you get into the literature of people that are worried in the same way I'm worried about how external quantifications and standard measures like press into us, there's one response, which is like, okay, then we need to get rid of institutions. We need to get rid of bureaucracy. We need to get rid of like big measures and get rid of like quantifications of like success. And I'm not on that side, because I think like large institutions do very valuable things and they need standards. And there are also plenty of like objective measures of success that are incredibly valuable and important, right? Like I spent a lot of time doing diversity work, and one of the things we know is what gets institutions that are systematically biased to change is clear measures of, oh my God, 90% of your employees are men. What's going on, right? So I think we need this stuff. But I also think like there's this realm of personally thinking through what you care about in response to your emotional experience that's also incredibly important. I mean, I kind of think there's no good resolution. I think there's this tension between our being as individuals and our being as collectives and groups. And these days, I think like, I don't even know where the slider should be, but at least we should be aware of the tension and not just let it like accidentally swamp us and just like go all on the institutional side and be lost as people without even noticing.
Well, I think that's a perfect place to end it. I really appreciate your time, Thi. Dr. Thi Nguyen from the University of Utah. We really appreciate you joining us. Maybe you can even come back and talk with us again at some point in the future.
I'd love to.
All right. Thanks a lot, Thi. Take care.
Thank you.